Chapter 31. Following your encounter with the elemental, you were once more stuck in the rock, for both of your parents were immediately adamant about keeping you there the moment you finished your tale of what happened. The three of you knew that you couldn't risk your mind by going anywhere without your knights, hence the two of them quickly decided and then informed you that with things being as they are, a new batch of knights would have to wait for the remainder of the year. It was their plan of restraining you to the castle without punishing you, a clear if a bit simple way for them to make sure you won't just wander off on your next adventure the moment they turn around. You mind it a bit less than the last time, seeing as interventions from a god like this are indeed somewhat troublesome, though getting some attention from gods that are actually capable wouldn't hurt right now. With how your creations were spreading the good word of the seven gods throughout the land, you're curious if they perhaps have better rewards to give, and if they would do so through a messenger of equally better quality. Mayhaps you simply can't expect a god that has only ever spoken to fish, to take up and learn human interactions and languages for you, seeing as you wouldn't actually expect such an effort from the remaining gods. You would already be quite happy if they had the ability to understand that elementals make for terrible messengers and rewards. And how delighted you would be if they had the sense to simply support your efforts of becoming a saint rather than sending anything silly like material gifts, or promises of power. For a moment you felt strange, and you could have sworn that somebody just smoothed over some expensive mistake at the last possible moment, but you quickly decide to dismiss that feeling in favor of focusing on your newest creations. You had already created a magma sword for yourself, so with time on your hands, you decided to get the armor done as well. And just like when you created your sword, you find yourself satisfied and free of anger, the pent-up agitation departing your mind and body without leaving so much as a trace. You were content for a change, and it showed in your work, as your new armor was graceful and imposing in just the right way, far above what even the best smiths could do with their steel. Your armor weighed nothing, and fit you perfectly as you wore it for literally the first time. You sadly had no way to actually use it in the rock. Since it's designed for combat, it exudes enough heat to kill a grown man with a simple hug. And while you find the image itself rather amusing, and a bit cute if you had to be honest to your embarrassment, you think it should be more than cancelled out by how monstrous it would look and smell in reality. What a way to get up your hopes for the future. Nothing's better than the thought of burned flesh and screams to cheer up a little warlord like yourself. Annoyingly, all that fun remains far off in the future for now, and the here and now requires you to do nothing for the time being. You can't even do something simple like extract some more gold for your house with all the levies around the rock, neither can you help out your guild with how the high-quality goods of the rock are bought up as fast as they can be stocked. There truly is nothing on your mind that would require you to do anything at the moment, thus you stow away your armor and decide to finish some of your books. So you sit just 5 minutes later in your chamber, blue book in hand. You look at your watch, who helpfully informed you that the sun will still be up for 3 hours, so you quickly made your way towards the gardens. With the winter magic over the rock properly disrupted, the snow became a lot more bearable, if not quite normal. So much so that after adding your resistance to the cold, the sight of the gardens, and a good book about a thieves' guild named Shadow Brothers together meant that the hours flew by one after another. In the end you were brought back to your chamber by your mother and her guards when they found you long after the moon had replaced the sun. She looked at you with worried exasperation as usual, so at least you knew she trusted you enough to remain in the rock, even if she didn't know where you were. Arriving at your chamber, you asked to make sure your mother was all right before you proceeded to your bed, to which she simply questioned what you had read that was so interesting you had to sit in the snow in the middle of the night. A rather valid question indeed. So you simply began to tell her the contents of the blue book that was now sitting on the bookshelf to your right. If only you knew what was coming, but like so often before you were blind to the world, and so the quiver of her lips and the glint in her eyes went unnoticed, until she asked you if you would say the book had stolen your attention, in the most bemused voice you had ever heard. Flat jokes. Your mother actually likes flat jokes. How in the seven hells are you going to survive this madness? Going by her reaction, you totally got the face for this. It was actually kind of funny if you're being perfectly honest, so much so that it seems like a tiny part deep in your mind quite likes the madness that are mom and dad jokes. Sadly, there's no way for you to start rowing back now. It was just too shocking to hide your reaction. What are you going to do if your mother decides your father should have some fun as well? Chapter 32. Around the time your 8th birthday came in sight, the world, your life, and even the war began to slow down even more, which surprised you, seeing as you didn't even know that a war that didn't have a single proper battle can actually slow down any further. You decide to blame the taxes for screwing up your plans, your current reasoning being that years without the taxes of the rock left the treasury more vulnerable to the usually so tender and undoubtedly skilled administration of the king than anyone truly expected. And while the coming years of winter will only bring a few months of snow with them, not having the gold to start up the economy and food production once the last snow melts should be the greatest problem the crown has faced in who knows how long. Starving peasants don't make for especially great soldiers after all, or well, they would probably do just fine as long as it would involve getting the current king's head on a spike. A problem, said king has probably realized a bit too soon, hence the lack of real conflict, leaving your plan of getting the little prince on the throne in shambles, especially seeing as the king can now only pardon your house, which your father would take every day of the week over wasting his troops. Though it's not too big of a problem, you would prefer having your plans work with the first try, but you guess that the opportunity of renewing the strength of the realm was just a bit too enticing for you to truly work. Mayhaps you should work on making your plans a bit more complex in the future, so that they rely on you and not the world around you a little more. There are still plenty of positives to be had from this failure however, and you would say that it feels as good as always to be validated. For what good is a continent-spanning realm if some lacking taxes are all it takes to break the strength of the crown? For now you can only hope that your father will remain in the Westerlands, which seeing as there is little love between the king and your father, is at least something you don't think you truly have to worry about. You guess that following the lead of your father until you have a better plan of achieving war isn't really a bad thing, especially with how quiet he is most of the time. Having some of his plans play out before you actually seems like a good idea, and who knows, mayhaps you can actually learn something from the way he will squeeze the crown for everything they've got. Seeing as the Westerlands have a population of nearly 20 million to the crown's measly 13 million, you actually see little in the way of time pressure. The 13,000 troops the crown could actually send directly just didn't qualify as a serious threat, not even against your family's border castles, with how reinforced they were during the first years of winter. You wonder how long you will have to wait until a new opportunity to split the realm presents itself, probably years all things considered, years that the realm will waste with peace. Instead of open conflict, the crown will most likely make the attempt to settle the matter with cloaks and daggers, while upholding the peace of the Seven Kingdoms as always. You decide not to complain any further, seeing as their lack of strength still benefits House Lannister, yet you can't quite help but lament how simple your work would be if your age would finally catch up to your ambitions. Not even your parents can truly take you serious, instead seeing your failures as proof that you're still a child, on both the inside and outside. Which while frustrating can't be helped with how you can't just tell them of your last life, seeing as you aren't brain dead. Something you honestly doubt you could currently say about your siblings, with how your mother happily corrupted the two of them this very morning, so as to entertain the three of you a bit. Thus instead of planning for the future, or simply reading a new book you now have the goal of surviving the worst jokes anyone could possibly come up with, like for example, what is brown and sticky, a stick. Which is funny exactly once, not that your mother and siblings seem to agree with your words, despite them containing a rather simple truth of the world. You thought they would get tired of the madness eventually, but it only degraded even further to jokes like, what do you call a fish with no eyes? A fish, which is just terrible, and really begins to strain your mind despite your best efforts to ignore them. In the end, you just used the size of your home to your advantage, which did the trick after a few short weeks of avoiding them, leaving you once more with enough time to focus on the future and mankind. Betting on the predictability of a lunatic was what denied you your war, and after thinking about it some more, quite deservedly so, for what you were thinking when you made that plan is truly beyond you. Instead of your own house opposing the crown, and so potentially going against half the realm, you should have first learned more about the world. But you still can't really accept that humans would genuinely follow a maniac that burns hundreds on mere suspicion. Just what is wrong with these people? You could understand that they would follow if he was a man of greatness, but neither the realm nor the king's dynasty can afford such madness from the man on the throne, so even the most loyal of vassals should see reason, shouldn't they? They can't truly fear the crowns. All in all, mayhaps 26,000 men, this much if House Lannister alone can bring around 39,000 men to the battlefield. Now can they? You truly can't see their reasoning at all, and it's not like the king will take kindly to his nobles lacking reinforcements anyway, so why is no one taking the opportunity? Chapter 33. after the Rock sent its taxes, and the future lords of the Rock were forbidden from entering the capital, the king took the opportunity and proclaimed the conflict to be over, of course with the crown being declared the victor, much to the quiet bemusement of your father and his vassals. You yourself have honestly given up hope on ever making sense of the madness around you a few months ago, leaving the matters of politics now fully to your father and his men. Instead you used your not-so-limited time on finally obtaining the knights you were promised. Reaching your newest goal turned out to be quite simple, so that annoying the right people, namely your parents, did the trick without a problem. Thus, to your great delight, you're once more free to explore the Westerlands, while you plan how you're going to bring the usual misfortune to the doors of House Lannister's enemies. Already the wildlings, as your father had called them, have put your gifts to good use, at least if the letters from the wall are anything to go by. It wasn't the original plan, but mayhaps House Stark will see reason once they realize that the crown won't be sending them the requested reinforcements. You truly couldn't see the royal army moving to help the north in the next decade or so, for the king will never send his troops to aid a vassal that in his eyes betrayed the realm, but well, you could see a future in which a number of the great houses like the Tullys and Arryns send out their men regardless. Which could see the king become so infuriated and unhinged that he finally loses his remaining seemingly brain-dead loyalists, for even they couldn't accept just doing one's duty to the realm as an affront to the crown, now could they? They could, as it turns out, they absolutely could, for of course they could. It wouldn't be any fun if the world would suddenly make sense after all, now would it? So yeah, those loyalists can't be helped anymore. You seriously thought for a moment that the vows of this world could be enforced by magic or the like, but there are enough oath-breakers around for you to scrap that explanation. Instead you settle on something ridiculous or stupid. You can't grasp what it is beyond that simple feeling of it not making sense to you even if you knew it, so you guess that some houses are just beyond saving. Sadly this means that you have no idea of how to procure equally loyal vassals for House Lannister. Not that the men of your father actually lacked loyalty, no, they were nearly loyal to a fault in your estimation. But would they remain so forever once their sons were ordered to march into war under the banner of the Lion? Those were the thoughts that worried you, for what would the future hold if everyone but the Westerlands had the same abundance of fanatics as the crown? The realm of the Westerlands is one of a kind after all. The mines of the Westerlands brought forth wealth without equal throughout the ages, and you know that such a great amount of wealth doesn't breed the bonds a history of shared struggles and conflicts might breed, which is to your current understanding a rather reasonable basis to doubt their inner loyalty. A problem you sadly can't solve by throwing stones at it, which was admittedly surprisingly effective until now. Thus after you consider your age you realize once more that your ways to approach these matters concerning you so are more than a bit rocky. Moments after you finished that thought, you had to strain yourself even more than usual to not show any of your feelings on your face, for once you realized what you thought you couldn't help but become massively annoyed. Now that you can finally leave the Rock again, you had no desire to see your mind infected with Rock jokes of all things. Thus you did what you always do if something you don't want to deal with appears. You focus on solving a randomly chosen problem with your mind or with your abilities. The problem that had the honor of distracting you was of course the loyalty of your father's vassals, but you still remembered that holding on to the loyalty of your men in the long term was beyond your abilities in your last life. Thus, you're a bit undecided on how to actually approach the matter beyond cutting the problem into smaller portions, so that you can finish them step by step as usual. You were quite happy that it took you a full 6 days to get a satisfyingly decent first idea, for you saw the days spent as proof that your way of thinking won't fail you as it did in the past. To your knowledge, most nobles have normally the wish to leave the world imprinted with their work and deeds, and after looking upon this wish in particular for days on end, you're sure that you could make use of it. With the concentration of might under the Lion, most houses would begin to feel this wish like never before, ever more desperately fighting to not be forgotten by history in the shadow of their master. And where there is desire there is gratitude to be had if one is capable enough, and you just so happen to know a perfect place that will endure throughout the centuries, and can display their legacy, and part in the world. The city walls of Lannisport before you were coming along nicely, and with around 70% being finished they made for an imposing sight in the light of the setting sun. But the work slowed down massively once the hands were needed on the fields and harbour, so that the remaining workers had their work more than cut out for them, most likely not achieving much beyond simply maintaining the massive wall as it was. So you supposed that with everything being as it is there was now no one that needed the work and would mind if you were to put in a bit of work yourself, Thus your knights were ordered to seal the city for the night while you finished the wall with an additional 33 coat of arms joining the Lions of the Rock, and now you simply hope that your future vassals will appreciate the results of your work. Chapter 34. With a surprisingly decent bit of moonlight remaining, you couldn't help yourself but create a few statues and a moat in front of the wall as well, just to truly make sure the city and its walls would remain standing for the ages to come. An improvement that would surely draw more eyes than you had first intended, but that should still be somewhat manageable with all the stars you added to your statues, seeing as they were trusted signs in Lannisport by now. Signs of your official work if you will, for you are still working on that plan of becoming a saint, and having added your little brothers and sisters to the protection of the city would further that project nicely should Lannisport ever come under attack. Yet there was another more important side effect from creating the little stone spirits as well, namely it allowed you to shortly relive the encounter with the water elemental, or more precisely, it allowed you to focus on and feel its unpolluted magic. It didn't actually feel like the snow you felt over the last few years, which created some interesting if bothersome questions about what kind of elemental was truly responsible for the snow, seeing as you had by now given up on finding anything but an elemental up in the north and all that. Not being able to blame a corrupted water elemental or the like quickly became your newest problem, for you had no idea what you were actually up against now. Both earth and fire elementals wouldn't make much sense, and water elementals are currently out of the question as well, leaving the possibility of an air elemental as more or less the last option, but there's no reason why an air elemental of this strength would be restricted to the north. You honestly don't believe in the theory, and even after you thought about the matter for a few more days that didn't change, which isn't how you usually feel after thinking so long about a problem, further strengthening the feeling. Though what did feel right was even more unlikely if that's still possible, for you could swear a corrupted life or spirit elemental had a hand in all this. But while life and magical beings alike call this world their home, and so have a connection to the proper elements, you can't imagine a situation that would turn either to such an extent. For you would guess with your admittedly limited knowledge that ending the lives of millions would be like a fire elemental trying to drown the world, a madness going straight against their nature, but then you're something like an earth elemental made of flesh, so the option of madness still feels right somehow. Perhaps someone was actually mad enough to bind the soul of a human to a spirit, or the other way around, so as to turn the spirit that couldn't harm life by its very nature into a weapon with nation-ending potential. Despite how much madness it would require to actually make it happen, it felt right to you, and it's not like the continent has a lack of lunatics seeing as you could see someone go through with it even today, let alone centuries ago. But that didn't help you in figuring out how to kill it if your guess was right, for you had no idea how a spirit that normally can't kill, but has access to the elements, would fight. The opposite of life would be death, so perhaps it can kill its opponents with a single attack, which you had not the slightest idea how to defend against. Mayhaps you could create and send a few thousand lesser statues against such an enemy, but you can't really see how anyone with that kind of ability would struggle to take the continent, not that you know how much of the continent is actually beyond the wall. It's a bit bothersome that the gods decided to remain quiet on the matter, but if they don't want to talk, you can't make them do it, even if it's most likely concerning the very reason for which you were brought to this world. Gods are gods, you suppose, and they do what they want as usual, probably trusting that you would do what they wanted you to do even without having to help you when you struggle for a bit. You see it as annoying but still understandable, and you did gain quite a bit from being invited into their world, so you won't complain too much for now. For you're sure that your future enemies will find their end like the fools that challenged you in the past, and that with or without the help of the gods, especially seeing as it was necessary to truly make sure you could guarantee a golden future for your house and family. But while you see your victory as guaranteed, you can't help but hope that this one won't require your life again, with how you actually have something to live for this time around. And even more importantly, you hope that the Seven Kingdoms get their act together before the next winter hits the realm, for you're sure the gods didn't bring you to this world as a mere contingency. And they surely wouldn't believe that you of all people would stand for the current state of humanity any longer than you had to, meaning the time it would take to replenish the losses after a war of such surely massive proportions was already granted to you. Yet while you feel like your thoughts and considerations were approved of by a higher power, you will have to wait until the ships from the north return with your rock to make sure you aren't just going mad. You think on the matter of the wildlings a few more moments, and find yourself confused, for why would they still be alive if you could feel the hostility of the snow in your very soul? It's not like the men that build the wall did it out of boredom. More likely they did it so as to not die to the spirit or the elemental that's even today still trying to freeze and starve everyone to death, right? Chapter 35. Why your seemingly destined enemy would need the tribes of the north to be alive matters little, you suppose, and you could always just kill them and be done with it should they turn out to be more important. So at least for now you decide to focus on the Ironborn, seeing as they make for a much simpler and overall more entertaining topic to think about, especially now with how so much of the Ironborn steel is in the hands of wildling tribes. Yes, you're quite sure you can finally have some fun again. Going by the reports on your father's desk, the fleets of the Ironborn were once more sailing normally, with the exception that a number of them were seen sailing north, most likely trying to rob the west coast of every tree they can get their hands on. It seems like looking at the odd kraken appearing before the Westerland's coast combined with the marshaled strength of House Lannister kept them at bay like you had originally planned. And as boring as these weeks of peace were, you had to admit that they also granted you a better understanding of the logistics surrounding a nation dependent on the sea. For the Ironborn simply don't have the soil to feed their population, meaning each ship they risk in the plundering of the forests owned by the Starks is a ship that can't supply the population with sustenance for weeks at a time. A balancing act that as far as you know requires knowledge of the sea unrivaled on the continent, which you can more than respect considering their culture of arrogance. Their lord, just like your father, seems to be a man you can happily call a proper human without having to adjust to their way of seeing the world. Perhaps you could convince your father to help out the good Lord Killion. One can always respect competence after all. You guess you won't steal their iron the first chance you get after all. At least if things keep proceeding as they were, they could turn out to be truly useful in the Game of Thrones, as some of the madmen in the capital called the struggle for the crown. And hey, your family needed a bigger fleet for a potential campaign anyway, so why not make some friends that could help your house transport the supplies the armies would need, once they were created? An open alliance at this time would of course be out of the question, and you're still quite displeased with their god, which you're sure your father hasn't forgotten either. For now the Ironborn simply had to suffer for a bit, so that the Westerlands could continue to mobilize and expand its armies in the rock, away from the prying eyes of the Crown, who now had the pleasure of finding the fleets of the Ironborn that moved to raid the north, which isn't half as easy as it sounds. For ships are simply faster than horses, and with House Stark having no fleets at the ready, and the royal fleet being on the other side of the continent, it would be near impossible to keep track of their ships, especially seeing as the Crown wouldn't know or believe that a great number of their ships were destroyed by a kraken. No, not with the current king, for he wouldn't believe a single word of it no matter what source might deliver the reports. Such are the daily problems of men who serve under a lunatic after all. And with the situation worsening by the day, you're confident that even the Starks will begin to have their thoughts on the matter, not that you expect them to do much against the Crown with the north being invaded from the north and the west by warbands. No, you'd prefer if you didn't hear of them again in the decade, for the stone from the wildlings was normal, meaning throwing whatever is beyond the wall back should be possible even without the help of the great houses, surely at a steep cost with how long the winter lasted, but possible nevertheless. Thinking for a moment on how to proceed while the realm deals with the Ironborn, you would say that the Reach could make for a good and juicy target if its lord takes after the king in matters of royability. For just like the Iron Islands, the lord can make all the difference in the Reach, and you seem to be in luck going by the lacking defenses despite quite the number of Ironborn fleets being unaccounted for. Now the question became when to strike, namely before or after the Iron Islands were inevitably burnt down. There would be the option of sinking the royal fleet after they finished their invasion, or if an early alliance between the Rock and Pike could be put together, you could simply stop the Tyrells from ever amassing their admittedly massive armies, picking them off a few thousand at a time. But sadly it all depends on the Ironborn enduring a long and drawn-out siege of their islands, and while it's not impossible, you honestly can't see your father agreeing to a plan based around the competence of the Ironborn. The realm, while sadly still largely at peace, was at the end of the day satisfyingly split, just like you wanted, House Lannister against House Targaryen, and House Greyjoy against the Crown and House Stark. If the troops were ready or another great house would take up arms against the Crown, you could finally have your open war. So very little is still lacking to push your father over the edge, and you know like anyone else that the king knows it too. Hopefully you will learn someday what the king actually did to earn the ire of your father. It would be rather interesting to learn what made the Lord of the Rock so, let's call it, enthusiastic when it concerned potential suffering for the current king, But no one in the Rock seems to have a death wish, with even your mother being awfully aggressive about it. Mayhaps you will one day get the chance to put the man in question into one of the many cells within your home to ask him in person, for if the great Aerys Targaryen managed to actually infuriate your mother, you don't think you will like his words any better, giving a great excuse to have some fun with him.